whose book Bird's Eye View is our selection for this month. And we're delighted to have Sue with us as the author, so we can discuss um, uh, what her thoughts are as she wrote it and her experiences of having come to that point. So, welcome, Sue.
Thank you, Robin and Pat. I'm delighted to be asked to participate in your book club.
It's lovely to see you in person and talk to you in person, having known you on Twitter there for some time. And so tell us when this book came out. When?
It was released at the end of October 2019, so it's been out for a few months. My husband always says, "Hold it up." So there it is. It's called Bird's Eye View, and it is very much a legacy project, I would say. The one thing about, as you know, getting cancer is you realize you don't have as much time as you might have thought you had, so it's best to get on the things that you want to do.
Had you always wanted to write a book?
Well, I am a writer by profession before I got cancer. And so, and I mostly did magazine and newspaper articles, and I did a fair bit of blogging. And I would say that, everyone tells you should write a book if you're a writer. And I'm kind of like, oh, no, I'm not sure what I would have to say, and dismissed it for a long time. But I actually started writing it before I was diagnosed with cancer. So initially I was writing the book about my life in healthcare. I've worked in healthcare my whole life. And also my experience being the mom of 3 children, but particularly my third child, Aaron, has Down syndrome. So I have worked in children's hospitals and done patient and family center care. And so I was writing a book specifically about that. And actually I just started it when I felt that dreaded lump in my breast, like the classic breast cancer story. And then I did find in the middle of, the 3 months of diagnostics to get to a diagnosis and then waiting for treatment and starting treatment, I actually put my book away. I couldn't even look at it. I think I didn't have a lot of emotional capacity. And also a lot of the book I had written about was a call for kindness. Based on my experience in the hospital with Aaron. And I had found during my cancer patient experience, I hadn't felt a lot of kindnesses in the cancer hospital. So it was too much for me to even look at. So I put it aside and then picked it up again, I'd say about 1.5 years after my treatment was done.
That was one of my questions is when did you start it relative to your cancer experience? So you been in remission for 2 years then or more?
I was diagnosed almost 3 years ago in this February. And so I only had 6 months. I shouldn't say only because I do minimize my experience, but I had 6 months of surgery and then radiation treatment. And then I took about 1.5 years, I'd say, for healing, and it spent a lot of time in therapy. I'd say doing as people call it sometimes, the extra stage of cancer, the mental health piece of it was something I had to work on quite a bit before I could pick up the book again. And then I realized it wasn't only a book about being Aaron's mom, it was also a book about my patient experience, but I had to process that a bit and give it some time before I could look at it again. But I journaled all through my whole cancer thing because I've always kept a diary ever since I was a little girl. And so that was a natural thing for me and a healing thing. And I did blog about it, some of those experiences, but I didn't look at the book until I felt like I'm still healing. I don't feel like I'm healed yet, but I don't think maybe I never go back to the way I know I don't go back to the way it was before, but I felt healthier, so I could pick it up again.
What do you
How long did it take you to write?
One's mortality, that there's limited time, is that a big piece of the things you have to consider when you go into healing?
I think for me, a big piece of cancer was that whole existential question about your mortality, and really it is right, I'd say, in front of your face. And before it was just kind of a concept that we're going to die. And, even once you have a sense you're going to get diagnosed and then you get that diagnosis, that becomes true. And so that is a terrifying notion that most people try to avoid their whole lives. So I think it was a lot of that, processing that. And then on the other side of it, once I felt I was starting to heal, I realized I'd better get on it. Like, this is my chance, because I don't know, with breast cancer, 1 in 3 comes back as metastatic. So I just never know, right? So this might be a window for me. And so I tried to be, I had this clarity that I had to get it done. And I also had an event I was invited to in Australia called the Gathering of Kindness in November that my family and I went to. And so I had a deadline. So that also helps if you're a writer, is to have a deadline of some sort, because it does make you treat it as a project and actually get it finished.
So it took you how long to write?
I'd say with my break, so I probably I'd say maybe if I was going to add it up, 18 months in total, but I had a lot of the material already done. So, you know, there were pieces that had been published before, like in the Globe and Mail and Canadian Medical Association Journal and stuff. So I had to go around and get permission to get those reprinted. But and I also wrote a lot on my blog. So but I did work with a structural editor, and she really helped me to figure out what was relevant, what wasn't for this book. And also, I would say she helped me clean up the blog post. So I'm always hesitant to say it's my blog and I created a book, because I also had to add a whole bunch of new chapters and transitions and figure out the flow and all that kind of thing, that's the hard work for me, is the more structural editing part. The writing part is not hard, but I am a writer. So that's something that comes very easy and naturally to me. And I know for other folks, that's the harder part. But the editing I found difficult, especially editing personal work, because it's hard to cut out. It's hard to know. So I really I worked with this woman named Mish Phillips from Hambone Publishing, and she's actually in Australia too. And she was very helpful, because she could look at it from a broader view than I could.
And how did it change you to write the book?
I know Arthur Frank, who I love, who wrote The Wounded Storyteller, he talks about that writing is more of an act of discovery as opposed to reporting. So I think often as patients, we get asked to come and tell our story, and a lot of what I would have done initially was just tell about the experience, like this happened, this happened, this happened. That's more of a reporting. And I think sitting down to write the book was more of an act of discovery. So especially my editor, I tried to be self-reflective when I wrote it, but my editor really helped me with saying, what does this chapter mean to you? And what do you want your audience to know? So that was the reflective part that I really had to do a lot when I did the writing of the book. And I think that part was hard, because the writing wasn't hard, but the thinking about what it meant to me, why it was important to me. There were some very personal questions that came up from that, like why was I in so much grief when my son was born? Because I do have quite a few chapters about when he was initially diagnosed with Down syndrome. And what I realized is that I was grieving. I mean, the baby I expected wasn't the baby I got, but it was because of my own feelings about disabled people and my own ableism. And what does that say about me? And like, that is a very humbling thing to think about and to reflect on. And writing the book forced me to do some of that. And why am I always looking for kindness in healthcare, which is very much a theme, especially for the cancer part of the book. And well, you're a psychologist, so you probably could answer that. But I'd say if you're going to write a book, it's good to go to therapy at the same time. That would be my recommendation.
I'll get all that stuff getting stirred up, I guess.
Yes.
Especially if we're so retrospective, right? So that would be, Erin is what, 18 now? I mean,
he's 16, but actually the book starts when I pretty much when I entered nursing school, which was when I was 18 years old, and then ended up dropping out. So I actually had to look into that a little bit too, not just say I was in nursing school and then I transferred out and I got my English degree, which sounds like just a nice wrapped up story. But the more interesting question is why? Why did I leave nursing school? And these stories you tell in your head, writing the book forced me to go back and look at those stories and say, the why part.
yeah, the theme was there that you left nursing because of the lack of kindness in nursing, and heading all the way through to your final mission, which is to talk about a lack of kindness in healthcare and how the need for kindness, and how what I was struck by was how in your recording about you described very tiny minutia actions that healthcare providers that provided comfort, and some that were like, awful, dreadful, terrible things, which, experienced veterans of cancer like like myself would go, oh yeah, yeah, the nasty secretary, yeah, yeah, that one.
Yeah, then they're seen it all, you know?
You've seen it all. That's right. But
Yeah.
I remember you talking about even like, "Hi, how are you? My name is," the tiniest thing that a healthcare provider can do, and what a huge difference it makes, and it really, really does. And so my hope, I guess, for you and your audience for this book is that healthcare providers will read it and will go, I really should introduce myself when I waltz into someone's hospital room and stand over them and start doing stuff to them. Maybe I
Right.
should just say, hello, my name is so and so. I'm a
Right.
nurse for so many
Right.
hours. Something, anything. Just those little tiny their oversights to the provider. They're massive.
And it isn't limited to medicine, as you point out. People come out and say that your friends come out and say the darndest things. Why didn't you
Right.
take better care of yourself? How did you cause this? I mean, the things people say are remarkable,
Yeah, it's
not in a good way.
and I think for me, I was especially vulnerable and fragile at that time. So I am a sensitive, feely person to begin with, but it was even made worse by having cancer. I describe it for myself as I was stripped bare. Like that's what it felt like. I had no, and it was different than, being my son's mother, which he had lots of experience in the pediatric health system and certainly, with school, and like there's lots of advocacy opportunities if you love somebody who's disabled, certainly in this day and age. So what I realized is I hid behind that role of the mama bear, and the mama bear is strong, right? And I almost like I had all this armor on and a big mama bear costume and stuff, and so I protected myself and my own self very much so, because it was almost as if I was playing a part. But when I got cancer, all that got taken away. And I remember I had people email me and say, oh, you just need to be a strong advocate like you are for your son. And what was hard for me is I expected myself to be that way, but I couldn't. Like I was just paralyzed and felt so small and tiny. And what I realized, in writing the book and documenting everything that happened, like you said, Robin, it was those, I like to call them tender gestures, those pieces of tenderness in healthcare that actually helped me feel a bit stronger, right? When I was still scared. So, the mammogram tech who, when I was having my biopsy, which was a 4-hour biopsy, was terrible. And you kind of have to go in the mammogram machine, and it's just like you're in all these weird positions and you can't move. But my hair had fallen into my face, and how she had, I mean, even saying it now, right? She had brushed the hair back from my face, and how, there was 4 hours of misery and pain and terrible experience, but I choose to remember that. And if she hadn't have done that, I would have only the negative experiences.
Right.
So I think that healthcare professionals have this great power to temper some of the awful pain that they have to inflict on patients, right? And that's one thing. I was in Toronto at the beginning of the month, and I talked to a lot of clinicians at 5 different healthcare organizations, and I really emphasize the idea of what I call the warm blanket. So those tender gestures that really can make a huge difference for us when we're suffering.
Yeah, yes, and it was interesting because your book made me reflect on those same moments for myself. What were moments that were the nadir? I could go on and on and on. But what were some moments of a kind gesture that just made the difference that it stands out in my memory? So horrific hospitalizations can be made less horrible by the thought of. I had one nurse who came and see me in the middle of the night, and after she did everything, after the end, she just patted me on the cheek a little bit.
Yes.
Just the sweetest little thing. Just
Yes.
a that thing too, and how, boy, I remember that as a kindness. And 10 years later, I still remember.
That leads into the need to heal. And you talk a lot about healing, and particularly at a retreat. Would you talk a little bit about that? Because I find that really interesting. And was there a pivotal experience at that retreat that really sent you off in a strong healing direction?
Oh gosh, I did go to a retreat for cancer patients at whatever phase we were at, whatever kind of cancer. It didn't matter, from an organization called Callanish here in Vancouver, and luckily, if you live near a big city, we often have these cancer supportive places. Like there's Wellsprings in different cities, and that's the idea, is to help with the healing part of it after treatment is done. Because I mean, I'll just do a bit of a dig here, but unfortunately, the medical system doesn't. They don't go there. They don't offer much for therapy or psychosocial oncology, like nothing. You're on your own when you're done. So luckily, I live in a big city, and I was able to find Callanish, and I did start seeing the therapist there, and they have a sliding scale, so it's accessible for people, which is awesome. But I decided I was at a point where I wanted to meet other people who'd had cancer, because I'd been very isolated and alone in my experience. And so I signed up for the retreat, and it was up by Whistler, so it was beautiful in the mountains. And I think the one thing, it was like, I talk about warm blankets, like the idea of the warm blanket a lot in the book, and at hospitals they have blanket warmers, and if you're lucky you can find one and get yourself a warm blanket. And that retreat was like that for me. So what the people who run Callanish do is they blanket you with love. Like, I don't know how else to, like, they treat you so well. Like, you're almost all, I remember my therapist saying to me, so you're going to have to allow them to be kind to you, she said. And that's that, as a caregiver and someone who's looking after everyone else all the time, like, that's a hard thing. That was a good lesson for me, actually, because you're all like, what's going on here? Is the other shoe going to fall? And like, no, actually, they're just being like, they meet you in the driveway, and somebody helps you carry your luggage, and there's flowers in your room, and they cook for you. And it's funny because I think it was 7 women and 1 man participant. And all the women, after we finished eating, we got up to, put away all our dishes and stuff. And they're like, no, we do that for you. So they forced this kindness, like we had no choice but to succumb to it. And then we did a lot of hard personal work, like group work and talking about death, and in the mornings, and then in the afternoons, they would have massages, or you could do dance, or there were all these like super healing things that happen in the afternoon, because we were quite, fragile and vulnerable in the mornings. And so that's how they set up the retreat. And you kind of had to trust the process. It was a 4-day, and at the end of it, I felt a little bit whole again. I think it helped put some of myself that I had lost back, which I maybe had never had my whole life. And that was to be kind and allow others to be kind to me.
It's interesting. The sort of image that's coming to my mind is sort of like drips of kindness, and then suddenly you get to bathe in kindness.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I feel, my one mission with my book is that it gets in the hands of health professionals, especially students. I've had a couple of universities, faculty of nursing and another faculty of family medicine say, we're going to sign this for required reading. And that's what I'm a bit desperate for, that, because I think these little drips of kindness, as you said, Robin, can happen in the hospital setting. They can, and they're within the control of the individual clinician, or the secretary, or the parking attendant, or the lady in the cafeteria. Like, they have the power to help brighten somebody's day. And it's by doing these little things, like we talked about, which actually aren't little things, they're big things for us, especially when we're vulnerable and suffering. So that's one of my messages that I do preach, that is within your control. It's not about, the system won't let, people blame the system.
The budget won't allow me to introduce myself.
Yes, yeah, like there are some things, like, to help. I think it'll help clinicians take back some control, because they struggle too. I know, especially nowadays in healthcare, with being rushed and not feeling like people appreciate them, and they have morale and well-being problems. But I think reconnecting with the people they signed up to serve is the key, and that's something they can control themselves. Not like the system doesn't need changing, believe me. That's something I've been fighting for ever since I entered healthcare. but the fact is we have control of it ourselves as individuals. That's one of the realizations I think I got from writing the book as well.
So so your intended audience is for healthcare providers and for other, I'm assuming other people who've walked the same road, people who've had kids with disabilities, people who've had cancer. How have you found the general public response of the people who do not walk that path or have never walked it?
Yeah, it's been interesting. So it's a bit of a hybrid model. So I didn't go with a big publisher. I did try that route and I got rejected a few times, and I'm not very good with rejection. So I decided, my husband and I also co-own a health communications company. So we know people, right, who can design the book and who can copy edit. And so we're connected that way. So we thought, well, we'll piece it together ourselves. We'll figure it out. My husband's a project manager, so he's very good at, delivering things. And we had this deadline, like I said. So I'd say, so we didn't have like this publisher to do the marketing for us to get it out into the hands of the general public. So, but what I did have is, I'm very lucky because I worked in healthcare a long time. I have lots of connections. So, and Twitter has been very awesome for that too, although Twitter can be a
job of promotion. It's all over the place.
Yeah. And my husband certainly has helped me with that because I'm a bit reluctant to do that. And so he's been pushing that a little bit, which is to say, and what I realized, I was talking to Dr. Rana Oddish, who wrote In Shock, her In Shock book, which is a beautiful book about her experience in healthcare. And she gave me some good advice. She said, as opposed to thinking that you're marketing yourself, think about, or even you're marketing your book, think about your message. So my message, I have two messages, and one is about understanding how it feels to be a patient and caregiver in healthcare. My stories hope to advance that, the understanding of how it feels for students and healthcare professionals or anyone who works in healthcare. And the other one, I hope that if patients and families read it, is that I hope that people feel that their story is powerful and that they should own their story and share it in some way. People don't have to write a book, but the idea of storytelling and how even for our own healing purposes, how it's really important. So I'd say those are my main audiences. And I haven't had a lot of exposure to the general public because I haven't done the typical book circuit. Although my husband, I don't know how he managed to do this, but he managed to get into chapters. So it's in chapters now. So it's available to the general public if they happen to pick it up. And I hope it has a beautiful cover. And so I've been going to all the bookstores and looking to see where it is. And, you kind of do that and stand there and look at it. There's something about that that's very, so I hope, but I haven't had a lot of response from, so it's mostly been folks who work in healthcare or experience healthcare. But if you think about it, in the end, that's going to be all of us. So that's a pretty big population in itself. Yeah.
Believe it or not, we're coming up to close to half an hour of our talk already. So I have a question I like to ask all our authors, and that is there a question that you haven't been asked about your book that you would like to be asked?
Oh, a question I haven't been asked. I'd say, I think the question of what I have learned since it's been released to the world is an interesting one. So like I would definitely go back and edit it. And I've been talking more about tenderness as opposed to kindness, because I worry that kindness implies kind of a nice thing, and nice can be patronizing sometimes, I think. And I've certainly found that in Aaron's world, right? People are nice to him, but it doesn't mean that, like it can get all messed up. So I think a lot of what happened when I went to Australia is the events I spoke at, the Gathering of Kindness, were for staff, and it was for staff well-being. And what I realized is that we're all in this together. So people who work in healthcare, people who receive healthcare services, like we should be talking about all this together, about how the system needs to be more kind and tender. And we tend to talk in silos because the healthcare system is so siloed to begin with. But what I realized was everybody's in some sort of pain, and it is patients, and we're there against our will, but it's also the people that are working there. So if we could take the time to understand each other, I think that's where the humanity in healthcare comes from. And I think initially my book was kind of a patient book, a caregiver book, but now I think it's actually about everybody and how we could show each other tenderness and how that would actually help all of us heal. And so I think that's the one thing that I've learned for sure, that it's not us and them, it's us together.
That's a great insight.
Is there, do you have plans for further writing that you'll be doing?
Oh, yeah. So when I wrote this book, it was huge. It was like over 100,000 words. And so I worked with my editor, Mish, and she's like, well, there's 2 books here. There's not just one. So we had to strip the other book out. And so what I decided to do was this book, which is very personal, and it's only about my stories. And people have said to me, why didn't you write about other patients' stories? And I don't feel comfortable with that. I think I only represent myself, and I don't want to represent all patients. That's something that I struggle with and I don't necessarily agree with. So that's why this is a very personal story. But my other book, which is mostly written, and I just have to sit down and take a good look at it to start with, is called Ducks in a Row, and it is about the patient engagement world. So I have worked in patient and family centered care. I worked at the Children's Hospital in Edmonton for years. And then I moved here to BC to work again in the Children's Hospital, and I was the family engagement advisor. And of course, I've chaired committees and been very involved with this engagement movement, like for actually, 15 years. And so that's almost near the beginning. So I have a lot of stories about that as well. So I'm a storyteller. I'm not a researcher. I'm not an academic. So the Ducks in a Row are the stories about how to do engagement effectively. And again, it's the same as clinical care. It's about the relational piece of it. It's about the relationships. It's about getting to know each other on the committee or on the council as human beings, not as you're the doctor, I'm the patient. And so I have some lovely examples of that. So that's my next book, is more talking about my work, the work that I've done in healthcare, and having my son Aaron, he's the one that introduced me to this type of engagement work, like 16 years ago when he was born. And so I want to focus more on that the next time around. That's the next one. My husband's like, you must have 3 in you, but I have no idea what the third one would be like. Absolutely.
Well, the second one is needed, and it sounds wonderful.
Yes. So I just have to carve the time. I need a deadline. If you guys give me a deadline, I could work to it. That's what I need.
This time next year.
Okay. All right. We'll have a conversation about the next one. Okay, good. That's good.
All right. You got it. You got it. This was great today, though. Thank you.
Thank
so
you
very much. We could talk for hours. You have such an interesting story in your book. Robin, what's up for the next Cancer Book Club?
Our next Cancer Book Club in March. Actually, we might have to defer it a little bit because I'll be traveling, unfortunately. March, turns out I need an eye surgery and I won't be able to see the author that we have on the screen. But the next book we have lined up is The Girl Next Door Meets Cancer. And it is the blog of a young woman who did not survive her cancer. She had a rare form of ovarian cancer, which she fought heroically, but ultimately did pass away from. So I really love that book because, unlike a lot of our books, which are written by definition by survivors, survivors can write books, that in retrospect, she's telling the story in real time as it happened to her in real time, and then the blogs just stop. Mm-hmm. And so it is to me it addresses the powerful myth or message that somehow we who survive cancers are somehow better, stronger, wiser, more faithful, more whatever, when really we're just lucky. Right. And even someone might debate whether we're lucky too in the bigger scheme of things, but really everybody who's really had cancer knows someone who has died, and that person who died was just as much a warrior, fighter, right, etc. So it dispels the myth, that it addresses that sort of hero myth of the cancer survivor, and I really I like to look at that. So
anything new next year for your next book?
Right. I'm gonna write that down. Let's book it.
Thank you so much for taking the
Yes.
time to be with us today. And we look forward to our next chat.
Excellent. Thank you too. Thanks to
Take
both of you.